Hi, my name is Alvin Ainsworth. I'm here with Mr. Paul Waterson of Australian Venue Co. Australian Venue Co. is of the largest pub operators in Australia with over 170 venues throughout Australia and New Zealand, and $650 million of revenue. We're going to have a conversation with Mr. Waterson about how the business has managed over the last couple of months and what the future of hospitality, pubs, and retail is in Australia, particularly here in Melbourne. Can you describe the feeling of shutting down 170 pubs and turning off a $650 million tap?
Yeah, it was certainly something that you don't prepare for. And as a business, you've got all your risk management plans, but you never think in your wildest dreams that something would shut down all the pubs at once, many of which have been operating since the 1800s. And then to get something like 12 hours notice to essentially shut them down after we'd had a week of increasing restrictions was just mind-blowing. And having to manage through that with 4,000 staff was it was a really challenging time.
What did you do with your 4,000 staff?
Well, in the first instance, we stood them down and they had to either access their annual leave in the first instance, which is a challenge in itself when you've got people accessing their accrued leave at a period where you have zero revenue coming in. And then fortunately, within 2 weeks, the government announced JobKeeper, and JobKeeper's really been a lifesaver for us because it's enabled us to keep, we're about 2,500 of our 4,000 staff are on JobKeeper. It's enabled us to keep connected to the staff, and it's enabled us to now open these venues in a way that makes them sustainable, even though there's really heavy restrictions.
Now we're turning into the recovery phase of all this. Are you going to be reopening all 170 of your pubs?
Yes, we are. Yeah, we've nearly opened all of them now. So Victoria is the last group of pubs to reopen, which we've done this week. So we've reopened all of them. But to be honest, you wouldn't do that if you didn't have the support of JobKeeper, because typically a pub, you're operating probably about 27 cents in every dollar goes back to staff in terms of labour costs. And under the current restrictions, that's closer to sort of 85, 90% of your revenue is going back to staff pre the subsidy on JobKeeper. So what JobKeeper's enabled us to do is open in a way that we wouldn't be able to if we didn't have it. Look, I think in the long term, the changes aren't really going to be perceptible. I know there's an argument that structurally the industry needs to change in a formal way, but if you look at some of the pubs, I mean, the pub we've been in now has been around since about 1880.
This is the Prince Alfred on Church Street.
That's right, yeah, in Richmond.
Richmond, excuse
me. So these businesses have been around for 130 years plus, and they've traded through a lot of tragedies and wars and depressions, and they've forever bounced back. So I think while you might see incremental change, things like order at table, things like spacing, I think inevitably people will return to good pubs. Where you might have a bit of a challenge in the short term, in the next 12, 18 months, is those really busy venues that you typically operate on, say, more of a one person per square metre basis, the bigger club type venues. But the classic old pubs like this, I think, will go on forevermore. You know, you can never replicate some of the licences that these venues have. We've got some of the venues in the city that can operate 24 hours a day. Now, that's not available to other new entrants into the market, so they're really defensible businesses. And there's still gross increase in alcohol consumption, and there's premiumisation of alcohol. So what we're seeing is greater yield in the product. So even if volume is largely flat, that premiumisation of the product enables you to get revenue growth year on year on an ordinary basis.
How have you navigated your way over the last couple of months with your landlords, and what has that done to your relationships moving forward?
It's sort of a bit overwhelming when we sat down that first week under the closure and thought, gee, we've got about 120 landlords I now have to get in contact with and try and structure something to make sure that both our business and theirs will go forward on a sustainable basis. And I've got to say, perhaps surprisingly, it's really strengthened the relationship in well over 90% of cases. We had that framework, but as you say, we weren't eligible for that code of conduct. So we used that as a framework, mainly on rent deferrals. We got rent abatements from two different groups, which were interesting. The large REIT companies were very good and supportive of making sure there was a tenant there long term. And the publicans who still own the freehold. So they were the guys who ran the pubs previously, knew what this would mean to us at the business. So both ends of that spectrum were great in giving us rent abatements. And through the middle, we got very good rent deferments.
What's going to happen to the future of rents and incentives in the pub industry here in Melbourne particularly?
Yeah, I think the challenge is going to be the time it's going to take to recover. And I think whilst we're under a fairly restricted operating environment at the moment, we've got our labour being subsidised by JobKeeper, it's manageable. But until you get that 1 in 4 metre restriction lifted, it's going to be very challenging to go back to the revenue levels you were previously. So I think what we're going to see is one, greater sharing of information between tenants and landlords in terms of how each of the pubs is going. I would like to see a pivot to more turnover as a percentage of sales rent.
So away from base rent only.
But other than base rent only. And I think, I'd like to think that a larger company is attractive to a landlord because we do have big marketing systems and processes behind us, that makes it attractive to landlords to work with us because they know we have the infrastructure to try and build that revenue over time and we're going to be here for the long term. So I think you're going to see more of a collegial negotiating relationship. I think inevitably the industry hasn't got a lot of capital behind it at the moment because the enormous unwind of the working capital in these businesses during the shutdown has depleted a lot of capital. So I think we'll be hoping that landlords can assist, certainly in terms of incentives, in order for us to do things like new builds.
In 2014, Australian Venue Co had 5 venues. Now you have 170 venues. Is that rapid expansion expected to continue once we get into this recovery?
Yeah, absolutely. We want to continue to expand the business. We're one of those businesses that have grown through acquisition. And I think when you get size and scale in this business, you get that leverage, variable cost leverage that perhaps other businesses don't have. So typically when you're buying leasehold businesses at say 4 to 5 times normalised EBITDA, you can typically get a turn of synergies through things like your beverage contracts and your food contracts and your labour management strategies as well. So we'll continue to grow through acquisitions for the long term. I think in Australia there's about 7,000 licensed premises, and I think I'd estimate about 1,000 of those would fit our acquisition criteria. So, we want to continue to grow for the long term. Well, I think the challenge in this market is what is the valuation, because everyone's trying to work through what is the sustainable earnings post-COVID. And I think the issue that people looking to divest their pubs are going to have in the short term is that it's going to take time to establish whether their earnings are going to go back to the pre-COVID period.
What's your advice to a pub operator that's trying to prepare his business to sell to a group like yours?
Yeah.
How do they set it up?
I think what's really critical is that the venues are run professionally. And I think what's been great about this industry in the last 3 or 4 years, it's been really professionalised in terms of things like payment of staff. So payment of staff as per the award has got to be done properly, and you've seen where that hasn't been done on occasions and the consequences of that. So I would say pay your staff well, run the business well. You can see moving to cards rather than cash. So run a very clean business, recognise your revenue properly, look after your cost structures as best you can, pay your staff properly, and have a really clean set of books that enables people looking to acquire venues to be able to make an informed choice about what the likely venue earnings are going to be going forward. We were one of the early investors in Mr. Yum, which is a startup here in Melbourne that does order at table, and they pivoted to an order at home solution very quickly with a much lower commission rate. So we tried that, but inevitably that market was so crowded that we decided that we can't go as well as those restaurateurs. So we spent more time planning for how we're going to reopen and looking after the staff in the meantime.
So going to dark stores and online only, do you think there'll be a time where customers will only be ordering food online?
I can't see it, Zalman. As I say, these pubs have been around 120, 130 years. Online was great and it worked really well when people were ordering to home when they were stuck at home for a bit of variety, and the quality was exceptional in most cases. But I think people are going to want to get out again. People want to get out, have a beer with their mates, catch up with their families, and pubs are always a great place to do that. We in fact went the other way. So we bought a beer business called Hawthorne Brewing about 3-4 years ago, and they were one of the early craft brewers and very, very good beer. But what we found with Hawthorne was the retail margins were just so skinny that you had to do big volumes through the pubs in order to justify it. And we got to the size where the price we're procuring beer from the major brewers was cheaper than what we could produce that beer from ourselves, the Hawthorne beer ourselves. So, and at the same time, our margins got compressed by the majors. So we thought, well, we're obviously much better at running pubs than running breweries. So we sort of all but packed up that business and just focusing on the pubs now. I think, craft beer there's some brilliant product out there. I think the challenge for the industry is that it's been sustainable because they've done exits on really high multiples and multiples of sales rather than the base underlying earnings of the business. And they've done that as the major brewers have looked to consolidate and grow their craft beer brands. I just wonder whether in the long term that's going to work, because I think the majors now have a very good craft portfolio.
Australian Venue Co. have 170 pubs. In Queensland, you have some pubs in shopping centres only. Do you have any pubs in shopping centres here in Victoria?
No, we don't. And we've watched that trend with interest over the years, and we've seen these lifestyle centres being developed in the major shopping centres. Our preference is in those high street type settings and CBD type settings, mainly because there's greater foot traffic and I think there's greater sustainability of the brands in the long term. So the challenge with shopping centres is every 5-7 years you need to reinvigorate the brand, you need to refit out the location, and it's moving so fast and it's quite trendy. We're more focused on those long-term assets that have been around 50, 100 years that we know are going to be around for 50, 100 years more plus.
How do you manage these buildings that are 100 years old?
Yeah, the good thing about this industry is you get great returns from doing what we call brownfield investments. So investing in these pubs and doing fit-outs in the pubs, you get typically less than a 3-year payback on that capital investment. Wow. And part of that capital investment obviously needs to be on the infrastructure. And the great things that we're doing now with landlords is looking to work with landlords, enter into long-term leases, whereby they're contributing to the fit out of the venues, and we either rentalise that fit out or we get things like rent incentives and rent holidays to do the investment in those businesses. So I think if we have $1 to invest in this business, the best returns are always done by investing in your existing assets.
How long are your typical leases?
Our WALE, including all options, is 17 years on average. So we look for long-term relationships with landlords. So you've got to find that balance between being a big business and having true local connection. So I think personalisation and understanding what the punters want to do when they come in to drink, and make sure that there's that connection with our local managers and the punters is really important. So I think you're going to see more personalisation and use of data to enable that personalisation. So we've got an app now that we're generating about 6 million of sales through the app. Before the shutdown, Mr. Yum was about 12% of our sales were going through Mr. Yum. And what was really interesting is the average transaction value going through those sales on Mr. Yum was about 25% higher than the equivalent sales going through the bar. So upsell and using data to help give the patron a personalised experience, I think is going to be increasingly common.
How important is outdoor areas to pubs nowadays?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Outdoor areas are critical.
Even with the restrictions around smoking?
Even with the restrictions around smoking. We took a view about 6-7 years ago that we wouldn't allow smoking in our outdoor areas. Wow. And we did that on the basis that people love to dine outside, and Melbourne, even though the climate's not great this time of year, people love being outside in the open air. And to be honest, I probably wouldn't look at acquiring a pub unless it had the potential for a great outdoor space. And if we look at some of the rooftop developments we've done in the last couple of years, we've got returns on those rooftop developments of 18 months or less on investment, because people just really love outdoor spaces. And the other great thing is you can activate those outdoor spaces in ways now that you could never do previously.
Rooftops, is that the most profitable real estate in a pub?
Yeah, well, I think it's the most underutilised real estate in the pub, isn't it? And if you look at rooftops have a real halo effect on pubs as well. So if you look at a pub like our Provincial in Fitzroy, so that sort of venue was turning over about 70, 80,000 per week. Wow. We put a rooftop on it and the turnover is up to 180, 200,000. Now the revenue from the rooftop itself was only 50,000 additional, but because it had a whole halo effect, it just invigorated the whole pub again, and we got an enormous return. So rooftops are a great way to invest, and they're a great way to add value to old pubs.
Out of your 170 pubs, how many of them have rooftops?
Well, we've got about 15 with rooftops,
okay.
But it's really the CBD and inner suburban pubs that really benefit from rooftops, I think.
If you could pick your next venue, how big would it be and where would it be?
I think long term, I think within 10 kilometres of Melbourne or Sydney CBD, I think a very traditional pub or traditional old building that can be converted into a pub-like location, and we've done that in King Street, for example. I think in locations where the demographic is sort of that 25 to 40-year-old, more one or two kids, because that demographic's also great. Family-friendly demographics also great to pubs, but I think you just really can't go past Melbourne and Sydney within 10 kilometres of the CBD.
Are your pubs becoming more family-friendly going forward, and can kids come inside pubs nowadays?
It's really critical that your pub is family-friendly, and it's something that we look for when we're looking to buy a venue, is how can families enjoy the space? And clearly there's some pubs where, you know, you're not going to want kids coming in, but the vast majority of them need to have family-friendly spaces where people can get out, multiple generations, have a meal. You got a sandpit in the corner, the kids can go have a play on the blackboard, play in the sandpit. You're, you know, a couple of metres away from them, you're keeping an eye on them, you're socialising with your mates. You know, there's nothing better. So having family-friendly locations is really critical. Location and the liquor licence. You can make any location work if you've got those two ingredients, yeah.